Councillors, officers, ladies and gentlemen, would you please be upstanding for His Worship the Mayor of Ballarat and the reciting of the Councillor's affirmation.
We, the councillors of the City of Ballarat, declare we will carry our duties in the best interest of the community and through collective leadership maintain the highest standards of good governance.
Didn't use my microphone. Sorry, everyone who might be streaming in. Councillors, thank you very much. The CEO and I discussed yesterday after the circumstances we're dealing with across the country, the state and in this city, to call an extraordinary meeting of council. Councillors, we are in very interesting times, uncharted waters that we've never been in this situation before as a community. From a councillor's point of view, we don't know what could happen in another 24 hours. So today a special meeting's been called to deal with the item of the CEO's delegation. I'll start with item 2, which is apologies for absence. There is none. All councillors are here. And councillors' disclosure of interest. On this item there's nil as well, councillors. We only have one item today, item 4, which is the officer's report, which is the S5 instrument of delegation, council to CEO. I'm going to ask the Chief Financial Officer, the Director, Glenn Callio, to introduce this. Thank you, Glenn.
Through you, Mr Mayor. Currently the CEO has a delegation of $250,000 for signing of contracts and other issues such as that. In the current climate we're in, that would not suffice if an issue came up that required more than that amount of money, as it's not anticipated that we'll be running contracts committees or council meetings in the foreseeable future unless the local government department allows us to conduct those meetings via remote. So in the interim, in order to safeguard being able to provide essential services to the community, if a situation came up that the CEO needed to award a contract in excess of $250,000, we need her delegations modified. We're recommending $5 million. As I said, unprecedented times. We're not sure of what emergency may come up and what that may require the organisation to spend to deliver those essential services. So that's the whole reason of this meeting and the delegation that's in front of councillors.
Thank you, Mr Callio. Councillors, do we have any questions?
Happy to move, Mr Mayor.
Happy to move, sorry. Do we have a seconder? Seconder, Councillor McIntosh. There is a question, I think, Councillor Harris.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Just through you, just to get some clarity on, so I take it to mean that within the state government guidelines, we can't have normal committee meetings. I'm just a bit unsure about that dynamic. I would imagine that the social distancing becomes an issue, but by the same token, is that state government haven't given us provision to hold a meeting by any other means?
Through you, Mr Mayor. No, unfortunately, the state government hasn't allowed us to hold meetings remotely. Unlike our agenda briefing last Wednesday, we were able to have 2 councillors not present. The Local Government Act is very strict and a bit archaic that you have to be present, which removes our ability to quickly call a contracts meeting. If an emergency occurred and we needed to award a contract for in excess of $250,000, we couldn't quickly convene a contracts committee to do that if members can't come to the council chamber. We couldn't do it remotely. So the provision of this item allows the CEO to approve that. We would put in protocols where we would advise councillors of what the issue is, why we need to have the CEO use her delegation in excess of $250,000, and then get the CEO to do that.
Councillor Harris, continue.
Just one more question, Mr Mayor, at least one more question. I was just wondering, plainly it's an increased delegation, and I was just wondering what feedback council will have if that was exercised. If you could give some comment around that, thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Callio.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the protocol that I would deem that would be put in place, we would advise council what the issue would be. We would advise council why the decision has to be made now, why it would not be practical to call another meeting, especially if you were this time last week, you wouldn't have anticipated that we would be sending all our staff home to work. I would envisage that in the next week or two that non-essential travel would be not allowed by the government. Hence, we couldn't all assemble like we are now. So just looking ahead, as this is not going to be a 2-week process, governments are talking about it could be a 6-month process. We have to set the organisation up that if in that 6-month period it is not practical to bring councillors together or a quorum of councillors together, that we can make decisions to continue to deliver those services. In the delegation, we've written it in such a way, it's only in those circumstances that we can't get a contracts committee or a council meeting together in order to approve the works that need to be done. If we are able to do that, then this delegation cannot be used. So we've written it with that safeguard for council that the CEO could not just use a delegation whenever she chose to. It's only in certain circumstances that delegation can be used.
Councillor Tillett has a question, then
Yeah, a couple
Coates,
of
then
questions.
Rinaldi, then McIntosh.
The explanation from Mr. Callio has changed my view a little bit. I did think the 5 million was perhaps a bit high, but if the delegation is written as he has indicated, strictly that it can only be under those circumstances, and that the councillors will be informed before it's exercised, then I guess the 5 million is a reasonable amount of money, because it's effectively a quasi vote of council before the CEO can then use the authority to spend the money. We must be in a position where this organisation can run unfettered in what we could imagine as being the worst of circumstances, and I suspect we're not in the worst of circumstances yet, so how you judge that's a good question. So so long as we are comfortable that is the intent of it is that we be advised. The question in relation to what happens should the CEO fall sick, however, God forbid, would be an issue. As it happens now, if the CEO goes on leave, she makes the delegation as best she can. I would like to see an agreement, whether it's written or accepted, that if the delegation is to be transferred, that the council will be advised who will be the delegee prior to it happening, if that's possible.
So, Madam CEO, are you able to answer that in relation to if you're unable to be available? The title of CEO, how would that then be structured?
Yes, thank you, Councillor. Again, as we are in unprecedented times, what I would ensure that all councillors are advised in advance of me putting in place acting arrangements for an acting or interim CEO. Those people will be drawn from our executive leadership group, so the directors. In the first instance, we need to work through that process, but all councillors would be advised prior to that decision being made.
Coates had a question.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, through you, perhaps to the CEO, does it appear to be becoming more likely by the day that our face-to-face council meetings and briefings, including our ordinary meetings, may be cancelled? I'm aware that perhaps some councils are moving to do that today. I think City of Yarra have advised that they've cancelled all of their council meetings and briefings.
Thank you, Councillor. My recommendation to Council would be that we don't follow that path. I think it's incredibly important that the governance of the city continues. We will continue to provide briefings and information to councillors as we're required to. Yes, we are in an emergency situation. We don't know how long that will last for, but there are still core activities that the city is responsible for and the councillors are responsible for directing, it would not be prudent to forecast a suspension of council or activity. With that regard, so my recommendation to councillors would be to continue on that advocacy, to have opportunities for council to meet remotely so that you can actively participate in civic life and actually implement your roles as councillors.
Councillor Rinaldi, put you in next. Have a question?
Yes, I do, thank you. And maybe to the CEO, maybe to Mr. Kelly, our director, the figure you've come up with, $5 million, and we're talking about an unknown certain going forward, whether it's going to be, I think it's only mentioned 6 months a moment ago. So the question is that enough at this point? And how did you come up with that number?
Through to Director Callio, thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, just relying on a bit of experience in local government and possible scenarios that may come up, I can't think of a scenario that would come up that would exceed the $5 million. If it did exceed $5 million, I think we would be in a whole lot of strife. So most scenarios that I could think up, $5 million would cover those. I think it's greater than $5 million, then I think the state's in a huge emergency. So there would be different scenarios going on. I think state government would start to take control.
Thank you. Councillor McIntosh had a question.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, just a question in regards to the delegation and the advice coming back to us. Because there's not that item in the recommendation, I'm wondering, even in reference to Councillor Hudson's view as well as the mover of the recommendation, whether we could have something similar to must have CEO or CEO's representative report or advise council on each action this delegation allows, so that we are informed. The community do expect that we are the decision makers. We have been elected to do so on their behalf. And I think it's imperative when we're talking about such a significant amount of money that there is the appropriate information and communication with the whole group of councillors. So just wondering, Councillor Hudson, your views on adding an item to that recommendation that suggests the CEO must, or the CEO's rep must report or advise council on each of the actions in response to this delegation.
So thank you, Councillor McIntosh. Just before we do ask that question, just wanted to get the understanding. This is a fairly standard kind of procedural type of motion that's set in place. Is that something, firstly, that can be added in that line, or also what are the options? How is council looking from the organisation point of view to structure it that we have that process in place? Can I go through to you, Madam CEO?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Councillor McIntosh, for the question. It would be possible to put an additional recommendation, although it would not form part of the delegation. So I needed to be really clear that the delegation has to stand in its own right. But if council so wished to seek an additional recommendation or additional motion that stipulated that a procedure needed to be put in place, which meant that all councillors were notified prior to the exercise of that delegation, in advance of the exercise of that delegation, then I think that would be appropriate.
So that would need to be foreshadowed, and we deal with that after this motion.
You can either do that or as an amendment.
Councillor Johnson just had a question first, then Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have read through the recommendation a number of times and I just can't see where it says anything about in the event that council is unable to meet. Is it possible to make that clearer in the recommendation?
Over to Director Callio.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's actually in the schedule. If you have a look at the schedule, it sets out very clearly that it can only be exercised if a council or a contracts committee can't be held. So it's not possible for the CEO straight after this meeting to go and award a contract for $300,000.
Sorry, Councillor Harris. Councillor Maloney had a question first. Sorry, my fault. Councillor Maloney.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you. And a follow-up to Councillor McIntosh's question really too, and the CEO's response, that I accept that the CEO's suggestion that we have perhaps an additional element to the motion which requests or requires the CEO to consult with councillors on extraordinary use of the delegation powers, but also, if I could add to that, that the CEO also consult with councillors about the change of her role if she's unable to fulfil that role. Is that possible, and is that okay with the mover and the seconder of the motion? And I'll have a second question as well, Mr. Mayor.
Yep. Question to Councillor Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess reading recommendation 1 that says they be delegated to the person holding the position, to me that's pretty clear that whoever is occupying the position of CEO, this delegation will actually ride with them at the time. So the other bits we're talking about, that will become self-evident, whoever is the either CEO or acting CEO in the absence of the CEO, I would imagine.
Would you also look at putting that item, additional line in relation to a procedure around that communication and what level is being used?
Yeah, quite happy for that to be added when I think the CFO was saying it will be a procedural matter anyway. Councillors will be informed, so quite happy for that to be, or the intent of that to be captured in a 6th recommendation.
Thank you. One more question.
And additionally, as well, Mr. Mayor, I guess if you could please, Mr. Mayor and Madam CEO, give some comment as well in regard to the consultation that you've already had with the local government minister and local government Victoria. I just find it potentially staggering, and I would hate to think that this is potentially one of our last meetings as a council, and it's just to delegate a lot of our powers effectively to the CEO. It's a fairly mind-boggling exercise to think that we don't have the ability, as many businesses are, to meet online and to make decisions. So if we could please get some comment from Mr. Mayor and Madam CEO about the approaches that you've made to local government.
We'll do a tag team on this one. One big one for myself is communicating with a lot of the mayors across the region, from a regional cities Victoria, from a Central Highlands, and even through to Melbourne as well. Around that reason, how do we actually function as a council bound under the Act, which doesn't provide that flexibility to, number one, close the gallery, and also number 2, how do we run a council meeting where you have to be physically present if we are in lockdown, and what does that mean? We've been putting that through. There is a letter that I'm just about to sign through the local government minister. The MAV and the local government Victoria, as much as they're filtering information through, it has been limited information, and it is well behind than what's been led by the federal and the state. So we really are going by what's been put, and really what everybody's getting that information at the same time, and then we're waiting for what that interpretation means to us. As a council, the CEO and the leadership team have been working very hard to put together the right plans in place to deal with this, and that is why the organisation went very early last week in doing the closures that were done, and then trying to respond to that as we go. I don't think it's high on the priority of government right now, but in these extraordinary times, absolutely we should have some sort of exemptions as part of the Act, considering the Act that was adopted or Parliament did will not be enacted until May. We still need exemptions, so that will be something of high priority around lobbying to ensure that we can get those changes so we can run the business of council. Madam CEO, do you have any other comments?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And again, thank you, Councillor Maloney, for the question, because I think it's an important one to highlight. In addition to making direct representations to the Minister, I have also made representations to the CEO of Local Government Victoria and to the CEO of Municipal Association of Victoria last week, also requesting the ability for council to meet remotely and to use similar clauses that were modified and applied to library corporations. So for a number of years, library corporations operate in very similar ways to local government, to local councils. Those requirements were relaxed to enable remote or teleconferencing. So it's not that they can't happen; they could happen, but it's not provided for in the Act currently. So I think with these emergency situations that we're facing at the moment, we will continue to lobby on that in that regard.
Councillor Harris, and then Councillor Coates, and then McIntosh.
And probably it's pertinent to the scheduling thing. A twilight clause, does that exist in the schedule?
Good question, Madam CEO. Is there a twilight clause?
Currently, no. However, having said that, there is a requirement following the election, assuming that the election still goes ahead in October this year, there is a requirement for council to review this delegation in any event. What you could stipulate is that you wish it to be reviewed as soon as the emergency is over.
So that would be an additional line that we'd need to put in there. Yeah. Councillor Coates.
Just to clarify through you, Mr. Mayor, to the CEO, so there, just to be clear, there is no provision in the new Act either coming in May for any remote voting? No.
Nothing in the new Act. There is an item in relation to closing to the public if there is security concerns, and in this case this would be the case, but that by the looks it hasn't been enacted as that Act of Parliament, and the indication was May, so we're still a couple of months away. Who am I missing? Sorry, Councillor McIntosh. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, just wondering what other states are doing in this space. Obviously, our State Government and Local Government Act that comes from state government gives us these guidelines that we hold. Is that exactly the same for each of the other states, or is there a different way that they operate?
Through to you, Madam CEO.
Thank you, Councillor McIntosh. Look, each individual state has very different approaches to the way that local government is operated. It's vastly different between, so for example, Queensland and ourselves. I'm not aware of any special arrangements that are being made in other states, so it's really on a state by state basis. So, and neither would we be controlled centrally. So effectively. From a central government perspective. Effectively, we are, local government isn't yet recognised in the Australian Constitution, so we're reliant on our State Act.
Through you,
Another
Mr. Mayor,
question.
just to follow on from that, really all I was after there was if there is an operation in another state that would set some really good guidelines for us, that could give us some good reference points if they're doing something already that works well. That's more around my questioning. So I guess at this stage of the game, we're not aware of any other states operating in a different manner?
Every state has their different act in relation to it. In relation to Victoria, councils are cancelling council meetings at this stage, and we rely on the local government minister to provide exemptions around what our act is.
My question was not, I'm very aware of the current situation that we have here in the state. It was just, are other states operating in a different manner that we could benefit from? If they've already got a different way of operating with their meetings, then it might be worth us looking at that. That was more my question.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Given that these changes would have to be voted upon, in fact, the Parliament would have to amend the Local Government Act. That would require a Parliament meeting. They haven't actually set a date for when they're going to meet again, and at this time I would assume that it would be very low on the priority list given everything else that's happening in the state. I would assume that in order to comply with the Local Government Act, we're going to have to continue meeting. So have we considered what that looks like and how we can potentially adhere to the guidelines about social distancing and still meet as required?
Today is an example of what we're doing. The concern, and I think what Director Callio said, what is the definition of essential versus non-essential, and what would be put in place as it's changing every 24 hours? Does that mean a council is essential or not essential? It's still an unknown to what that is. And then the next question is what happens if we do have a couple of people that might be affected, and then also the risk to family and friends that might be there as well, or mostly family. It's an unknown situation how we continue to run. If things could change very quickly. At this stage, the meeting on the 1st is still scheduled to go ahead, but that might change within 24 hours on what we're capable of doing or what they're capable of doing.
Can I
Councillor
just
Dawson?
ask a follow-up question then? Within the local government, does it stipulate how often council is required to meet? And are we then in trouble if we can't achieve a quorum, or do we have to at least try to meet and see if enough councillors show up and then we are at least complying with the Act?
I'll go direct back to Madam CEO, but we have our schedule set at the beginning of the year. Each year we set our calendar, but there's very different times and uncertainty in what we do. But Madam CEO, your comments on that?
There are only a couple of council meetings that are required to be held. One is the council meeting immediately following an election, and another is the call of the council. So there was a call of the council required. All others are in accordance with the schedule, the ordinary meeting schedule that has been established. If we fail to achieve a quorum, it does provide some difficulty, but no sanctions. And I think that's probably the point that we're at the moment. The other component part is the ability, as is evidenced by today's meeting, the ability of the Mayor and 3 or more councillors to call a special meeting of council. Again, if we can't achieve a quorum, it just means that the resolutions can't be passed, but there's no sanction for council or councillors if you can't attend those meetings.
What's really important is an exemption. I think the local government minister could do an exemption for us to, number one, close to public, and number two, to then do what we do now, which is actually online or in some form to be involved. But yes, but Councillor Tillett, you had a question?
Yeah, I do actually. I'm referring to the schedule, which is really what the meeting is about. We're about covering the situation of how we govern if we are unable to meet for any reason. And the schedule clearly it does 2 things. It requires the CEO to be satisfied that the council can't meet. Then she can act. But she can do a lot more than spend $5 million, because points 4.2 down to 4.10 and probably beyond actually indicate other things that she can do which we normally would have had the sole responsibility of doing. So this isn't just a financial delegation. It is us delegating to the CEO in the event we can't meet, in all the circumstances that officers think we might have a problem, just in case. And I think it's a very wise move. And I do think that the terms of the schedule, which are the conditions under which we are giving this delegation, is quite appropriate.
Thank you. And those items were under previous delegated authorities as well. So today the only change is actually that financial limit under the controls. Thank you. Councillor Maloney.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. It's probably a follow-up from what Councillor Tillett just asked. Perhaps I'm reading it wrong, but my interpretation of it, it says the delegate, as in the CEO, must not determine the issue, take action, or do the act or thing if it involves one of the following. And one of the following, as Councillor Tillett's pointed out, is 4.2 through to 4.9, talks about things such as making local laws, approving the council plan, strategic resource plan, and special committees and a whole bunch of other delegations. Is that correct that, and maybe just a point of clarification through Mr. Mayor to the CEO, is it that this delegated authority actually allows the CEO to do those additional things? So it's more than just the $5 million delegation. It's also the approval of the council plan, making local laws, and several other things as well. I interpret that as not do those things, but maybe I've interpreted that wrongly.
I'll go through to the governance officer, Mr. Montgomery.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, yes, that is correct. That is the limitations of what the CEO cannot do. Those are the limitations that are being applied in relation to the only thing that they are exactly the same as the current conditions and limitations that is in her current instrument of delegation. The only difference being is what has been applied in item 4.1 is the condition where a council cannot meet or a contracts committee cannot meet, the exercising of a delegation in excess of the 250,000, which was the limit, has been provided as a limit to 5 million.
Okay, so just as a quick follow-up to Director Montgomery, I suppose we, in that case, won't have the CEO effectively going off making local laws as she so chooses. Not that I trust Justine would do that in the first place, but just want to again clarify that. So we won't have a situation of CEO making up local laws without our consultation.
Again, through you, Mr. Mayor, yes, that is correct.
Councillors, any other questions? No. Councillors, we had a lot of discussion around item 6 being a process around communication and process around, what was it, communication, and also what the steps are for doing that delegation, and also item 7 to actually review delegation once the state of emergency is completed. As the mover, Councillor Hudson, are you happy for that? And the seconder?
Yes.
Second was Councillor Tillett. Happy with that? Sorry, Councillor McIntosh seconded. Sorry, are you happy with that, Councillor McIntosh?
Of course I am, that you remember that I seconded it, yes.
Sorry, thank you. Now, councillors, do you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And clearly, councillors, we're in a period of uncertainty like we've probably never seen before, and nor have our own parents seen in the 100 years prior to where we're all from, World War II, I should say, not quite 100 years. But clearly we need the organisation to continue. We're seeing statements come out of federal and state governments, and clearly there is the role for local council to exercise its powers under things that it has control of. And in the current climate, with things that are changing on a day-by-day basis, we need to understand that the office of the Chief Executive Officer is vitally important to the ongoing function of our city. Whether we can meet or can't meet at times, and certainly the intention is around full disclosure to councillors of what those delegations may be used for, the urgency around some of those. But in the interim that we can't get councillors together to actually exercise that in a formal vote, we need to empower the Chief Executive Officer to do that on our behalf. Certainly also with the sunset clause, that while we are still in the state of emergency, or when the other tiers of government are able to say that we are through on the other side, that then absolutely this delegated power should then be reviewed, and we revert back to normal business practices in terms of CEO delegation. Picking up some of your points, Mr. Mayor, I also think that we should be looking for the direction to the local government minister to actually not be seen dragging their heels in terms of how local government, not only just for the city of Ballarat, but all around the state of Victoria that are equally as impacted, can actually come together and still do their function as they would intend to do as state government and or federal parliament. To think today with such urgencies as stimulus packages that are being put through Parliament with only 90 members sitting in the House because of social distancing, and some would argue, could that not have been done in a much more consistent way? So I think where we are seeing some of that being addressed by federal and state governments and saying, now is the time when this particular issue is in front of us, we need to see creative thinking outside of the square as to how the governance around decision making of civic leaders at all levels of government can actually continue. But in relation to the special powers for the CEO and the delegated authority, I'm very comfortable that we need to do this. We need to do it now to ensure that the CEO can act when accorded, when required, in terms of the days and weeks and potentially months into the future.
Thank you. And for just for the record for everyone, the item 6, I might as well read it out just so people have got it. We don't have a screen in front of us. The Chief Executive Officer prepare a procedure that outlines notification process to councillors prior to the exercising of the delegation outlined in item 4.1 of the instrument of delegation to the Chief Executive Officer. And number 7, a review of the delegation be completed as soon as the emergency event has ceased.
I'm happy with that.
Thank you. Now, Councillor McIntosh, do you wish to speak as a seconder?
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor. This is a very critical time for us as a city, for us as a state, and for us as a nation. And we want to make sure that the delivery of essential services does go along as smoothly as possible. We know that it is likely to mean an increase of critical roles that maybe we wouldn't have considered in the past. To know that the CEO has that ability, the support of all of our council, to make some significant decisions if the need arise, I think will give our community and our council a great deal of confidence moving forward through these really difficult days. It is imperative, as you've heard from the group of councillors, that we remain very informed of any of these extended decision-making opportunities, that we as a council or group remain very aware and in the leadership roles that we were appointed to by our community, and that we do have the opportunity to have significant communications and response as well as we're moving into a slightly changed format. So with the extra additions to the recommendation as we've discussed, I certainly do support the process, this recommendation, and the opportunity for the CEO to ensure that there is a prepared procedure that would be delivered to us as a group of councillors to ensure that we all remain informed and that we can therefore represent our community with a great deal of confidence.
Thank you. Councillors wishing to speak for or against? For. Councillor Maloney.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'll speak for. Look, I think it's extraordinary, I guess, that we've had to rush a special meeting of council and approve some pretty vast expansion in the CEO's powers with such a short amount of time and no actual formal briefing. But hey, we live in extraordinary times, so it is something we'll just have to adapt to. But I would hate to think that this has potential to be, our last council meeting. We enter a caretaker period ahead of the council elections in September, and for our last act as councillors to effectively be to hand over a significant portion of our councillor roles and powers to the CEO. But again, I support the motion for the reason that we are in extraordinary times and we don't have much choice. Local councils are important, local democracy is important, and we will be expected to play a major role in Ballarat's recovery when we start to come out the other side of this pandemic. And it will be hard to do that effectively with one hand tied behind our backs if we're not able to have formal meetings and make formal decisions as councillors, just purely because there is an archaic requirement in the Local Government Act and even the new version of the Local Government Act, which requires us to be physically present to make formal decisions of council. So hopefully, and I understand the state and federal governments have far bigger issues on their plate right now, but hopefully that is something that comes to the state government's attention in the very near future, allowing us through some mechanism to be able to continue formal decision-making processes. But nevertheless, we are in extraordinary times, and any other time I would be pretty frustrated having to approve such wide sweeping changes to the CEO's role. But I'm comfortable, especially with the addition of the sixth point to the motion that requires consultation. Thanks.
You, Councillor Johnson, did you wish to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I support this motion. I would also like to extend my gratitude to staff who have been working extremely hard over the last few weeks, and particularly in the last 24 hours given the changes announced, and wish you all the best in the weeks to come. I will also just raise an idea that I heard, given the difficulties many of our local businesses are experiencing at the moment, that the funding that we have set aside for events, grants, that be deferred, be diverted rather, to supporting local businesses. And also there are many calls that we provide some sort of rate relief to our commercial ratepayers in the city of Ballarat, acknowledging also that we as a council have tough times ahead financially in continuing to run our services based on what we predict will be significantly decreased funding for our organisation. I support the motion, and as I said, I wish everyone the very best in the challenging weeks and months ahead.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Any other councillors wishing to speak? Councillor Harris.
Yes, I'm deeply disappointed, Mr. Mayor. To speak for the motion, I really dislike this a lot. This is delegation, councillors. There's no consultation. It's notification. That's all we can expect from it. We can't do anything else, unfortunately. This is just, we have to have provisions for both in response and recovery. We have to have this provision put in. I am deeply disappointed with the local government ministry. I mean, how, you know, I don't really, I mean, you know, people are working hard, particularly in the health sector, but this is administratively simple. You know, this day and age, we should have had, when the Local Government Act was put in, they should have put these provisions in. It is appalling to think that we can't, with the provisions that we've got, be satisfied that when we meet video or otherwise, that people have understood the issues and can vote on those issues. It's a nonsense. And, you know, state government has got to do better in this space. It doesn't leave us in a great space. It's going to be a hard 6 months. I would much prefer it to be with consultation and appropriate council input. I think it is the time we need to serve our community well. So I feel let down by state government. They need to do better in this space, and I don't let them off the hook to say they've got other things to think about. A lot of people have got other things to think about. They just should have done better. But I wholeheartedly support, we do need this provision to be able to move forward, as we will have to put into that space in terms of how we particularly respond to our community. And I would also say that state government's got to do better in saying what that role is going to be. It's been particularly quiet in terms of specifying what our responsibilities will be within the response and recovery phase. So state governments have let us down here. I want them to do better in designating what local government responsibilities will be.
Thank you, Councillor Harris. Councillor Coates.
A quick question, if I can first, and then I'll speak to it. So the question is whether there have been any discussions or possible projections that budgets may be deferred at all. Has there been any discussion of that as a possibility?
Through to Madam CEO, I know state and federal governments have delayed their budgets, but from a request to, I'll actually go to Director Callio, unsure of any communication around what that means. Director Callio?
Through you, Mr Mayor. Unfortunately, the Local Government Department just reiterated the Local Government Act to us when we asked them a few questions. So, according to that, Council is still required to adopt the budget by the 30th of June. From our own ability to continue to deliver essential services, those ratepayers that will go through this crisis maintaining a job, we would require them to ensure that they pay their rates so that we're still able to deliver essential services. So even if the government gave us the ability to delay doing our budget until October, because of the way in which our funds come in, that would be disastrous for the council. We expect a fairly big impact on not collecting rates both this year and next year. So we're going to be relying on those parts of the community that do have a job, not impacted from a financial sense from the crisis. So delaying the budget's not a good idea, but yeah, nothing's coming out of local government on anything. So, and I wouldn't expect much to come out of local government.
Councillor Coates?
Yes, I will just speak for the motion. It is, I think, a real bind for councillors that we're in a really difficult position, that we're in emergency management mode and really unprecedented times, and hopefully will not have, the CEO won't have to enact too much in line with those additional budget requirements, but if it is needed, we can't predict. It's changing on a day-to-day basis. So I will also thank the CEO and the directors and the staff for really stepping up. That it's just so incredibly important for community confidence to see really clear leadership, really clear messages, and to maintain really calm but confident sort of decorum around how we're dealing with it. And I think it's really important for us as councillors to really be consistent in line with what we're communicating to the community in these really difficult times, and really acknowledge the social consequences that it's a health crisis, but it is actually quite a social crisis as well. Anxiety levels are really high for a lot of members of the community, whether it's around health concerns or business concerns, financial concerns, environmental concerns, connecting with each other. All of those sorts of things are really just, we didn't see it coming, but I think it's also an opportunity to pull together and really learn some very strong lessons quite quickly around building on that community resilience and social connectedness. If there is one small positive, I'm hoping that will be one.
Thank you, Councillor Goetz. Any councillors wishing to speak? No, there was no one against. I'll put the vote. Councillors, all those in favour? Thank you, councillors. That's passed. Councillors, just before we close again, these are unprecedented times. Things are changing rapidly every 24 hours or even less than that. The big thing, and Councillor Coates has said that, we are all in this together, not just as a council, as a community, as businesses. Everyone's in this, and we've got to think of our emergency services providing that service through this tough time, and they're doing an amazing job right now. But as we all know, and what we've seen elsewhere, this is kind of just the beginning, and we've got to then work on this together. And the big thing is, which we've been pushing, is about, number one, looking after yourself, looking after your community, and then looking after what that means to business. So be kind, make those phone calls, keep social distancing and good health, and councillors will come out at the end of this a stronger community, as well as hopefully we can put back into the community from an economic point of view at the end of this as well, from a council. Thank you, councillors. Meeting closed at 1:50. Thank you. Not in the morning, in the afternoon.